never thought humiliation could feel so sharp. It was almost physical, a cold slap that stayed burning long after the sound of my daughter. In-law's laughter faded from the phone. Old lady, come pay the $7,538 bill, she'd said, her voice full of mockery. And behind her, my own son had laughed. What they didn't know was that the woman they thought they could ridicule had already prepared for the day they'd cross her line. Before I tell you what happened next, make sure you subscribe to her retaliation, where women like me don't stay silent. We take our power back. The evening it all began, I sat alone at my kitchen table. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. My phone buzzed again with family photos from the dinner I hadn't been invited to, smiles, wine glasses, laughter that didn't include me. I stared at the images for a long moment, feeling the sting behind my ribs, then placed the phone face down. They wanted to exclude me, fine, but calling me afterward to pay the bill, that was their mistake. I stood, walked to my bedroom, and opened the drawer where I kept the leather purse my husband had given me years ago. Inside were my cards, my keys, and something more valuable. Every memory of the life I had built, the sacrifices I had made for the very man who now laughed at me. I ran my fingers across the worn strap, took a deep breath, and decided I wasn't going to be their victim tonight. The drive to the banquet hall was calm. My hands were steady on the wheel, though my mind raced. I thought about my son as a boy, his scraped knees, his shy smile when he'd brought me wilted daisies from the yard. Where had that boy gone? When had he become a man who could mock his own mother? I turned the thought over like a stone, and by the time I pulled into the parking lot, the hurt had transformed into something colder, sharper. Resolved, the hall was still lit when I walked in. Laughter spilled out through the double doors, the kind that comes from too much wine and too little conscience. I paused at the entrance, letting the light hit me. Several heads turned, forks froze halfway to mouths. My daughter-in-law Cassie blinked as if she were seeing a ghost. My son's smile faltered. Sadie, she said finally, her tone all sugary politeness now. We didn't expect you, no. I replied softly, stepping closer. You didn't. I walked the length of the table, my heels clicking against the marble floor, each sound echoing like a countdown. The waiter approached nervously with a slip in his hand. The bill. I took it without a word, glanced at the total, and felt the faintest smile touch my lips. $7,538. Expensive laughter, I thought. Cassie shifted uncomfortably. We were just joking earlier, she murmured, but I ignored her, drawing my checkbook from my purse with deliberate calm. The entire room had gone silent now, all eyes on the old lady they'd mocked. I signed my name neatly, then tore the check free and handed it to the waiter. For now, I said, my voice steady, consider this a lesson in generosity. My son exhaled in relief, mistaking my composure for surrender. Thanks, Mom, he said lightly. You're the best. I turned to him slowly, meeting his eyes until the easy grin faded. No, I whispered, I'm not doing this because you deserve it. I'm doing it because you've just given me exactly what I needed. The reason to remind you who I am. He frowned, confused, but I was already turning away. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene. I simply left them staring, whispering among themselves, uneasy because they could sense something shifting in the air. Outside, the night was cool and still. I stood beside my car for a long moment, letting the quiet wash over me. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was too small, too temporary. What I felt was something deeper, a current that moved beneath the surface, intention. They wanted to embarrass me publicly. Then I would show them what public truly meant. At home, I brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window as the city lights flickered below. My phone buzzed again. Messages from Cassie, half-hearted apologies coded in sarcasm. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the old folder of financial papers on my desk. My husband had left me more than anyone knew. Properties, investments, quiet partnerships in places my son had never even heard of. He thought I lived modestly because I chose to. I smiled. They'd called me old lady. They'd thought they could humiliate me, but they'd just awakened the part of me that remembered every skill, every lesson, every ounce of power I'd once put aside for peace. I took a long sip of tea, opened a new notebook, and wrote 3 words at the top of the page. They will learn. By midnight, I had outlined the first step. I wasn't going to yell or beg or cry. I would let them feel what real silence sounds like when it carries consequence. And soon enough, they would. I closed the notebook, turned off the light, and allowed myself one last whisper before sleep claimed me. Tomorrow begins my retaliation. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the blinds like it was testing me, daring me to step into the new day I'd promised myself. I got out of bed slowly, every movement deliberate, every thought clear. Retaliation didn't have to be loud. It had to be precise, and that I had mastered long before Cassie ever learned how to fake her sweet little smiles. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. There was a hum inside me now, a pulse of focus I hadn't felt in years. I made coffee black and strong, then opened my notebook again. The first page stared back at me. They will learn. Beneath it, I began writing names, places, connections, my son's business partners, Cassie's social circle, the neighbors who loved gossip more than oxygen. Every name had a purpose. Every one of them would play a role. I had been invisible to them for too long. That was about to change. By noon, I was dressed in a crisp navy suit I hadn't worn since my husband's last board meeting years ago. My reflection in the mirror startled me for a second, not because I looked older, but because I looked awake. My hair silver and steady, my eyes colder than they'd ever been. I smiled faintly. Cassie always said I was too traditional. She'd see soon enough how dangerous tradition could be when it held the power of patience. I drove into town and parked in front of a glass-fronted office building my husband's old firm, the one my son now pretended to manage. He never knew that my husband had quietly left me majority ownership before he passed. I had let him play boss all these years, thinking he was being kind by taking care of his aging mother. I'd signed the papers he pushed in front of me, smiled at the right moments, and kept every document filed neatly in my safe. Today, the game changed. I walked into the lobby, heels echoing softly against the marble. The receptionist, young and nervous, smiled politely. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," she greeted. "Good morning, dear," I replied, calm but firm. "Please tell James I'll be waiting in his office." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she nodded and made the call. Within minutes, my son appeared at the far end of the hall, clearly unprepared for the sight of me. His smile was tight, uncomfortable. "Mom," he said, trying to sound casual. "What are you doing here? Everything okay?" I gestured toward his office. "Let's talk in private." He followed me in, closing the door behind us. His tone shifted as soon as we were alone. "Look, if this is about last night," Cassie was just, "this isn't about last night." I interrupted softly, sitting across from his desk. "This is about today." He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" I slid a folded document across the desk. He glanced down, puzzled, then his face went pale. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "Your father left me his controlling shares," I said simply. "You've been managing, yes, but the ownership never left my hands." He stood abruptly. "You can't just, I can. I cut in, and I will." He stared at me, disbelief and frustration mixing into something ugly. "Mom, why are you doing this? Because you forgot who taught you everything you know about strength." I said, standing to. "You laughed at me. You let your wife humiliate me. You both assumed my silence meant weakness, but silence, I lean closer, is where I build storms." He swallowed hard, anger flickering behind his eyes, but I could see the fear too, the slow dawning realization that the woman standing in front of him was not the one he'd mocked. "I'm restructuring the company," I continued. "Starting today, I'll be reviewing every transaction for the past 2 years. You'll still have a position here, but under supervision." "Supervision?" He repeated, voice cracking slightly. "Yes, you'll report directly to me." He exhaled sharply, trying to regain composure. "Cassie won't like this." I smiled faintly. "Cassie will adapt." I walked out before he could speak again, leaving him staring after me in stunned silence. Outside, the air felt lighter. I could almost feel the old version of me fading, the quiet mother, the convenient checkbook, the woman who waited for invitations that never came. She was gone now. As I drove home, I stopped by a florist. The smell of fresh lilies filled the shop, reminding me of simpler times, but I wasn't here for nostalgia. I ordered a custom arrangement not for beauty, but for message. Each flower color carried meaning. White lilies for purity, red dahlias for power, and dark orchids for vengeance. The florist looked confused when I asked for a single card with just one line, "To Cassie with my warmest regards, Sadie." By the time the delivery boy reached their doorstep, I was already home, watching from my window as my son's car pulled up. I imagined Cassie's face as she read the note. The power of subtlety was something she'd never understand the way it crawled beneath the skin, whispering that something was coming. That night, my phone rang. I didn't answer, but I listened to the voicemail afterward. Cassie's voice was brittle, strained. "Sadie, that was. Unnecessary. I don't know what you're trying to prove, but," she hesitated, "you're scaring James." Good, I thought. Fear was the only language they respected. Over the next week, I began moving pieces they didn't even know existed. I transferred certain accounts, cut unnecessary expenditures, and placed subtle calls to board members who still respected my late husband's name. Every conversation was quiet but decisive. Every signature was a step toward reclaiming what was mine. Meanwhile, whispers began circling among Cassie's friends' questions about the dinner, the bill, the flowers. The gossip spread like wildfire through the same social groups that once adored her. I didn't have to say a word, people filled the silence themselves. That's the thing about humiliation once it changes direction. It doesn't stop until it's found a new victim. One afternoon, I drove to the private property on the outskirts of town, the one no one but my lawyer knew about. It was an old vineyard, quiet and sprawling, its gates still bearing my husband's initials. I walked the ground slowly, the air filled with the faint scent of earth and grapes. This was where the next chapter of my life would begin. I called my lawyer the next day. I want to transfer management of the vineyard to my name, I said, and I want every legal right prepared for succession under my control only. He agreed, though he sounded curious. Planning to reopen it, Mrs. Wilson. Eventually, I replied, but for now it will serve another purpose. That evening, I received a text from James. Mom, can we talk? Cassie's upset. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. We'll talk soon. I have plans tonight. My plans were simple peace and plotting. I cooked myself a quiet dinner, lit a single candle, and watched the flame dance. Revenge didn't have to be immediate. The best kind unfolded slowly, like wine aging in a dark cellar, richer, deeper, inevitable. Over the next several days, things began to shift in their home. Cassie's credit card stopped working. The car lease she'd bragged about was suddenly frozen due to internal ownership review. Their world built on arrogance and assumptions started to crumble at the edges. And through it all, I remained perfectly calm. Every morning, I walked through my garden, pruning roses and humming softly. Neighbors began greeting me differently, more respectfully. Some even asked for advice. It amused me how people's perception changes once they sense quiet power. One morning, as I was trimming a rose bush, my son arrived unannounced. His face looked worn, his voice hesitant. Mom, what are you doing? Cassie says you're ruining our lives. I set the shears down and looked at him. Ruining? No, James, I'm teaching. You just never realized the difference. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're making us look bad. People are talking. I smiled softly. They always do. The question is, what are they saying now? He had no answer. Go home, I said quietly. Tell your wife that debts always come due and hers just started collecting interest. He stared at me bewildered. You've changed. No, I replied. I just stopped pretending not to see. After he left, I went inside, poured myself a glass of wine, and opened my notebook again. On the last page, I wrote another line beneath, they will learn. They will remember. I closed the book slowly, my pulse steady. The first lesson had begun. The next one would leave them begging for mercy. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I say it's a wine best aged slow, deliberate and savored as it turns. By the time part 3 unfolded, my plan had stopped being a collection of ideas on paper and had become a rhythm, soft, inevitable, and impossible to ignore. Cassie's world had already hiccuped. Her card declines were the first tremors, small humiliations that rattled her confidence. People notice a card that stops working. They notice when a social post about a dream purchase disappears because the transaction fails. I'd watched from my window as she tapped and frowned, and then forced a laugh to hide the color draining from her face. That forced laugh was like a thread pulled taut, one more tug, and the whole thing would unravel. I could have called her out, screamed accusations, or made a scene in public. But temper tantrums belong to the young, and to those who confuse volume with power. Power, real power, is quieter. Real power rearranges the landscape while strangers talk and think nothing of the wind. So I rearranged. First, I tightened the legal screws with the precision of someone who'd read the fine print for years. The vineyard, the quiet holdings, the company shares, all of them were legitimate and in my control. I started the formal audits I'd hinted at. Careful, legal, unavoidable. Paperwork moved across desks with signatures stamped in ink, and those signatures carried the weight of my husband's name. The result was slow but public enough to make a difference. Certain expenditures were paused, leases were reviewed, and banking flags mundane. Administrative flags began to appear on accounts Cassie and James used without a second thought. Nothing illegal, everything procedural. But when a bank freezes a line of credit for a week pending verification, it feels like thunder to the person on the other end. I used patience like an instrument. I called one board member, an old friend of my husband, and asked a favor to review a series of legacy contributions that had, over the years, gone unmonitored. The friend complied with the air of respect owed to the late man whose name still opened doors. Conversations were had in hushed tones over coffee in a downtown club that loved old money and proper scandal. A discreet letter here, a request for meeting there. The network that had once supported my husband's work now listened to a widow who'd never stopped paying attention. They did not gossip, they confirmed facts. Meanwhile, I played the social chessboard. Word travels fast in our part of town. It always had. Cassie had thrived on that circuit, surrounded by like-minded people who reflected and amplified her arrogance. I began nudging the currents, not with slander or spectacle, but with invitations. An invitation to a charity meeting where Cassie was expected to present a donation plan. A polite note to the club's treasurer asking for a review of membership dues. A courteous email to the event coordinator reminding them that sponsorships were under review. People who once applauded her now had reason to pause and ask questions. They didn't need me to shout. They needed context, pieces of truth between polite lines. They asked those questions and watched as Cassie stuttered, as her rehearsed anecdotes failed, as her confidence retreated into canned phrases and empty smiles. That was when the real unraveling began. Her friends, the ones who fed on each other's approval, started getting nervous. We are a small crowd. News and silence both travel like wildfire. A whisper, "Did you hear about Cassie's card?" Another, "I thought she handled James' accounts." A third, "Isn't Sadie more involved than we realized?" They were careful at first, then curious, then cautious. Invitations dried up. Lunch plans evaporated. The quiet social exile is a cruelty I use sparingly, but when it lands deep. Cassie, who had wielded exclusion like a blade, was now on the receiving end. Her behavior shifted. The mask of confidence cracked at edges. She began to overcompensate, publicly posting staged photos, over-decorated tables, extravagant captions. The more she tried to prove everything was fine, the more glaring the fault lines became. Human nature does the rest. People compare, sniff, and then pull back. I watched the pattern and felt a calm satisfaction that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with justice. But I wasn't interested in destroying her completely. Cruelty is easy. Correction is a craft. The lesson had to be thorough and clear. Arrogance that tramples family finds its mirror. So I escalated, again legally, meticulously. I scheduled a shareholder meeting at the firm, a routine, plausible meeting. But I quietly ensured that key players would be present. I prepared the room in a way that made it impossible for my son to dodge. Legal notices, prepared reports, and confirmations that required attention. I did not want to humiliate him in public so much as to make him accountable. On the morning of that meeting, I walked into the conference room with a folder of documents I'd meticulously organized. My son's face when he saw me was a portrait of forced bravado before reality sharpened it. He'd expected my presence to be a mere formality, a mother's cameo. He hadn't understood that appearances can be a rehearsal for consequences. "Good morning," I said, and the word had a gravity to it. The meeting began formally. We discussed quarterly performance and minor logistics. Then I asked the chair for a moment to present a review I'd authorized. A hush fell like linen over the room. People leaned in. I spoke precisely, referencing transactions, patterns, and legitimate concerns. I wasn't accusatory, I was surgical. My husband's partners, men and women who'd watched me during times of grief and steadiness, listened and questioned. They asked for clarifications I had prepared. When documents were requested, I handed them over, neat and unambiguous. My son's defense was a stammering series of attempts that looked worse the more he tried. Cassie, not present that day, heard the reverberations later in texts, in calls, and began to feel the tremor. People who mattered began to question decisions made in her name. Why was this expense approved? Who signed this particular contract? Why is there a note about an unverified vendor? Each question was simple. Each answer revealed the gaps she'd glossed over with charm. The fallout was subtle but pervasive. Contracts pending signature were held. The car lease conversation I'd sparked in the background moved forward. Legal teams double-checked details. Suppliers who had been casual with payments suddenly asked for immediate verification. It is a strange thing to watch the world of someone built on confidence begin to ask for receipts. The more they ask, the less comfortable they become. At home, the strain grew visible. My son would avoid me some days and then come seeking advice as if he hadn't pushed me away. He oscillated between anger and a dawning shame that tugged at the corners of his mouth. One night he stood at the doorway, hands stuffed into his pockets, and said, "Mom, I never meant for it to go so far." His voice cracked, revealing the child he'd once been. I saw it then, not a man to be destroyed, but a son who'd been seduced by entitlement. My response was quiet, a mirror rather than a lecture. Then make it right. I told him, start by admitting you were wrong. He didn't take to it easily. Pride is a heavy thing to set down, but pressure grinds stubbornness into recognition. He began to attend meetings with me, sat through reviews, and slowly the boy who'd once run to me with scraped knees returned in small, awkward ways. He asked questions, he listened. He apologized to me in a voice that trembled. It was not complete redemption, but it was movement. I accepted that because justice is not revenge for its own sake, it is restoration of balance. Cassie, on the other hand, began to fracture in private. The quiet exclusion missed invites, canceled brunches, the polite distance of acquaintances gnawed at her like cold. She tried to buy back favor with gifts and frantic messages, but social currency is fragile once trust cracks. She texted my son complaints, she texted friends, she even called her mother asking for support. The mother-in-law, used to wielding a certain power of her own, found herself at a loss. Pride does not endure when the platform beneath it is removed. I did not gloat. I held a consistent face of calm. Part of my plan was to give Cassie enough rope to understand her mistakes, not enough to hang anyone. There is a line between teaching and cruelty, and I refused to cross it. My moves were corrective financial responsibility, public accountability, and the social consequences of thoughtless behavior. The community's reaction was a natural consequence of patterns revealed. Then there was the matter of the banquet hall, the speech that had accompanied her cruel joke about the bill. That moment haunted me less because of the money and more because of the ease with which they mocked me. I wanted them to feel the discomfort of being the ones exposed, so I began planting seeds of stories, not lies, never lies, but reminders of who I was. Involved, respected, a woman who had quietly supported causes, who had worked with charities, who had been a steady hand. Those reminders multiplied across conversations, across dinner tables, across the very social circles that had celebrated her belittlement. The pivot, the public moment I'd long planned, came during a charity auction at the country club. I had attended in the past as a donor and quietly held a place of respect among the organizers. When the opportunity arose to sponsor a major lot, I took it. I did not announce my intention in public until the night of the event. The hall was full. Cassie was present, glowing under the chandeliers, feeling untouchable because she'd convinced herself she controlled the narrative. When the auctioneer announced the lot I'd sponsored, the name on the plaque read not just my name, but the foundation in my husband's memory. I stood as people turned, surprised murmurs rippling like a breeze. I spoke briefly, not to scold, not to grandstand, but to honor work that mattered. I spoke about helping families who'd been left vulnerable, about dignity and the quiet support that sustains a community. The applause felt warm and honest. Later, as guests mingled, I watched Cassie's expression fold. People approached me with genuine gratitude. Invitations were extended to collaborate. The social tide shifted visibly toward me. Her smile strained as alliances rearranged subtly around the woman she'd tried to humiliate. That night, while she tried to project composure, I saw exhaustion under the makeup. She'd been outmaneuvered in the places she'd thought untouchable. The social clubs, the business circles, and the community events where influence counts. It was not vengeance so much as reclamation. By then, James, my son, sat beside me in the car and said, quietly, "Mom, I didn't understand how much you'd given up." I glanced at him, the man who'd laughed on the phone, and saw the little boy peeking through. "Maybe you didn't look," I replied, "but you will remember now. The path ahead was not about ruin, it was about correction. I wanted them to become better, not bitter. I wanted accountability to replace entitlement." Each administrative pause, each polite distance from friends, each careful question from colleagues, all of it was a mirror. If they looked into it and corrected their course, then the wound would heal. If they clutched at excuses, the consequence would deepen, and they would bear the burden of their choices. Sometimes I felt the old doubt, had I gone too far? Was I taking the role of judge when I should have been mercy? Those nights I sat with those questions like guests and did not give them the warmth of ownership. I reminded myself that compassion without boundaries enables harm. There comes a time when the kind must be firm so kindness itself can last. So I continued to watch and to act in quiet increments. The next phase of the plan would require patience and a few decisive moves, and I welcomed it. They had been careless with their assumptions. Now the world, the same one they believed would always applaud them, had begun to hold them accountable. The lesson was taking root, and as I closed my notebook that night, the line I wrote felt less like a threat and more like an assurance. They will remember. They will choose differently, and if they do not, consequences will follow them like a shadow they can no longer outrun. The air in the house that morning felt different, not the sharp, testing air of earlier days, but the quieter, steadier pressure of something that had changed direction. The small, controlled moves I'd set in motion were no longer merely signals or whispers. They had become mechanisms with momentum. People who had once moved easily through my son's orbit began to ask questions that could no longer be smoothed over by charm. Bank compliance departments required documentation. Sponsors requested verifiable proofs. Legal teams double-checked signatures. Little by little, the scaffolding of certainty Cassie had relied on started to wobble. I did not celebrate their discomfort. I felt a composed satisfaction, the kind that arrives when a long plan finally performs as intended. The vineyard's grapevines swayed gently in the spring breeze when I drove out that afternoon. They had no idea of the role they were about to play, and neither did most of the people who would later stand, surprised at how quickly things could shift. I had learned long ago that irreversible change usually requires one of two things: public clarity or legal finality. People can recover from whispers and gossip. They cannot easily walk away from a court transcript or a formal notice from a bank. So I prepared both. The audits I'd quietly ordered became inquiries that required documentation. The financial holds on accounts grew into formal reviews. Leases entered periods of verification. I made sure everything I did was above board, immaculately legal. If they were to be exposed, it would not be by rumor but by truth. When the bank's compliance officer called Cassie's cardholder services to verify a large transaction and found discrepancies, they initiated a formal hold pending proof of authorization. A delivery was returned. A luxury purchase disappeared into a pending queue. To the social observer, it was small and mercilessly mundane. To Cassie, it felt catastrophic. She tried to laugh it off, to stage an Instagram post about technical difficulties. But the posts were thin and rehearsed. The comments were polite but cool. People prefer to believe charming faces until the receipts make them question. At the firm, the shareholder review I'd set in motion led to deeper scrutiny. Contracts that had been rubber, stamped by people wanting to avoid friction, were now read with care. Suppliers asked for updated W-9s and proof of authorization. A vendor that had been casually hired without due diligence suddenly drew questions. I watched from a distance as colleagues who had once nodded along began to hesitate and then to prod. The ripple effect was careful at first, a raised eyebrow here, a polite question there, but it became a tide. When you stabilize chaos with focus, the chaos retreats into the corners where it can be cataloged. My son tried to push back. "This is ridiculous, Mom," he said one late afternoon, voice taut with desperation. "You're making everything difficult. Can't we just—" He stopped himself, unsure whether to say smooth it over or ignore it. It occurred to me then that part of the problem was his expectation that everything would be forgiven with a single payment or a quick apology. He had never learned that consequences have a duration. "You set the tone," I answered, not unkindly. "You chose silence when it mattered. You let people mock me. Now the choices you made are showing their true value." My voice was steady. My patience had the weight of law behind it. He left the room angry and ashamed, a combination I had seen before in different forms. Shame can be a beginning if it's allowed to lead to learning. Anger is only a detour. There was one moment that crystallized the shift for me, a public moment when the private machinery of consequence finally met community eyes. The country club's annual gala had been scheduled for weeks. Cassie expected it to be her stage, an opportunity to flash smiles, to show her curated life where sponsorships were applauded and social calendars applauded back. I, however, had arranged for a quiet presentation that would put the facts where they couldn't be dismissed. The program began with charity awards and routine speeches. People sipped wine and clinked glasses, servers moved like soft shadows. Then a slide came up during the sponsorship segment, a slide that listed not just donors but recent corporate activities tied to our firm and to certain projects that required clarification. It was tasteful, it was factual. Eyes shifted, murmurs rose and then quieted. Cassie's attempt to interject with a rehearsed joke needed context, and that context was now in public view. Gentle questions from respectful community leaders about due diligence and proper oversight echoed louder than her coy laugh. She laughed anyway, but it was brittle. Later, under the crystal chandeliers and polite applause, a friend sidled up to me and said in a low voice, "Sadie, we appreciate transparency. We hope the family will work through this responsibly." Her words were simple, but the implication was clear. The room had noticed. The social ledger had turned, and social goodwill, once a currency for Cassie, was now being transferred to a woman they had quietly respected for years. After the gala, Cassie's private world narrowed. Invitations she had once assumed would be automatic dwindled. Calls from certain club committees were delayed. People started asking to reschedule meetings. It's a peculiar punishment, polite depletion of opportunity, but it is effective. Opportunities dry up, and people are left to reckon with where their security truly came from. One evening, when the urgency of smaller collapses had built to a larger wave, their mailbox contained formal notices. A professional firm had been engaged to audit recent transactions. The letter was courteous, but it was unmistakable in its implications. Cassie's world, depending on unchallenged assumptions, required answers that couldn't be provided with charm alone. I watched her read that letter. For a brief instant, I felt the raw human thing, pity. Then I set it aside. Justice sometimes requires hard instruments. The legal review led to a meeting in a neutral boardroom. My son sat with his hands clasped too tightly. Cassie's attempts at smiling felt like a mask stretched too thin. I presented documents, quietly and without drama, to the independent committee. They sifted through them like careful hands through fabric. I saw the faces of men and women who had once deferred now leaned forward with professional curiosity. "These are clarifications," they said. "We need verification. Professionalism does not humiliate, it clarifies." I preferred that. As the formalities progressed, word leaked in small professional circles. Not the salacious kind of rumor that the tabloids crave, but the serious kind that cautious partners exchange over lunch. My son received calls asking for explanations. Suppliers asked for immediate confirmation. Cassie answered with flurries of text messages and long, desperate emails that tried to explain away what was increasingly unexplainable. She blamed vendors, she blamed miscommunication, she blamed naive oversight. The truth that she had enabled and cared less about consequences was harder to spin away. From the outside, my moves looked methodical. I had no intention of humiliating the children publicly for the rest of their lives, and I avoided spectacle. But public accountability is an educational tool in a town where image is currency. If you teach someone to spend other people's goodwill without care, then you must also show them the responsibility that comes with access. There were moments that hurt in ways the spreadsheets could not measure. My son found himself called into quiet but firm one. On meetings with board members he had always met with smiles. He confessed finally, in a voice thick with regret, "I thought I was protecting you by letting things be easy. I didn't want trouble." His admission was small, but it was necessary. Protection doesn't mean silence in the face of disrespect. I told him. It means standing for what is right, even when it's uncomfortable. He took that in, and in the following weeks his posture shifted. He began to answer emails promptly, to provide documentation, and to stop brushing warnings aside. The arc of accountability is rarely straight, but it is better than the arc of denial. Cassie, meanwhile, unraveled in private. She called her mother in tears and asked for help. The mother-in-law, who had once sat at the head of many tables with an air of entitlement, found herself offering advice that rang hollow. "Fix it," she said, apologize to Sadie, make donations, host events. She was a woman accustomed to buying goodwill. This case required more than checks. It required contrition and the humility to learn. I watched how the mother-in-law squirmed, too proud to bend but yet forced to navigate the complexities when a family's public image intersected with real oversight. There was a day when Cassie burst into my kitchen, furious and raw, her mascara streaked, her hands trembling. "You went too far," she cried. "This is my life you're ruining." I looked at her with the calm that had become my armor. "No," I said softly. "You made choices. You chose to disregard me, to mock and belittle. You taught your son to look away." I responded with clarity. "If you want restitution, start with apology and accountability." She sobbed then, half in fury and half in the shock of recognition. That night she sent a letter of apology to several community members, clumsy and defensive, but it was a first step. It is remarkable how quickly humility can be faked and how slowly it can be learned. A note in ink is easy. A genuine repair is a long labor of steady actions. I watched, and at times directed, their path toward restitution. That path was not meant to punish indefinitely. It was meant to restructure habits. By then, their social safety net had thinned. Friends who had once been certain now offered cautious advice. The card that had been briefly frozen for verification was released only after formal confirmations were submitted. The small victories they expected were now contingent on proof and accountability. They had to learn to plan, to record, to consult. It was tedious, but when you move from entitlement to responsibility, tedium becomes the classroom. I could have demanded more public drama, a press statement, a confrontation in a crowded room, but spectacle never teaches as well as consequence. People learn discipline when their world requires it. I had seen entitlement made brutal by experience in other places. I was steering them away from a harsher fate. I wanted them to be better players in the life they'd been given. In private, I noticed cracks of genuine change. My son wrote me an email late one night, longer than most messages, rower than apologies. He confessed how blind he'd been, how easy it had been to laugh while someone he loved hurt. "I am sorry," he wrote. "I will fix this." Those words were not enough, but they were necessary. Cassie, in quieter moments between the flurry, began to return calls to those she'd ignored, to apologize where she had mocked, to ask for advice and then actually listen. The mother-in-law, who had always relied on rank and expectation, took modest steps, small donations, a sincere note to a social committee, an effort to host a small, humble tea for neighbors she'd neglected. Change was messy and imperfect, but it was happening. I am not a woman who relishes punishment. I relish restoration. Watching them step into responsibility was, in its way, a victory both measured and humane. The most irreversible part of this phase was not the bank holds or the audits. It was the way habit shifted. Entitlement must be replaced with care. That is not immediate. It is the slow, awkward work of new rituals, apologies that are repeated with action, and the building of trust through steadiness. The final instrument of this phase was symbolic, but potent. I arranged for a small community forum at the country club 2 months after the gala, not a spectacle, but a sitting down, with, another kind of meeting. I invited neighbors, business partners, and a few people whose silence had previously allowed reckless behavior. Cassie attended, as did her mother and my son. We sat in a circle, and I spoke plainly about dignity, respect, and responsibility. I did not name all the specifics of their missteps that had already been documented. I spoke about the social compact we hold with one another, about how privilege must be accompanied by humility. It was not a condemnation so much as a blueprint. When it was over, several people approached me to say that they'd been watching, and that they believed in second chances if accountability was practiced. Cassie wept quietly in the car, embarrassed but oddly relieved. The mother-in-law, whose posture had always been rigid, reached out and squeezed my hand in a gesture that carried more meaning than any grand apology could have. My son sat beside me, quieter now, but steadier. Those moments taught me the true dimension of power. It is not in ruin. It is in the ability to insist on better and then to guide others toward it. The consequences I had put into motion were irreversible in the sense that habits had been interrupted and a new order had been initiated. But they were not permanent punishments. They were corrective measures with a path to redemption built into them. That night, as I closed my notebook and felt the tiredness of weeks of focus in my bones, I wrote a single line beneath the others. They will be different, or they will know why. It was not an ultimatum as much as a certainty. Change, once begun, shapes futures in ways that cannot be entirely undone. And yet, as the plan shifted from disruption to repair, I knew one thing remained. The final step of the story was still ahead. There was one more phase where the truth would be sealed, the lessons reinforced, and the family would either stand restored or fractured. The next act would require balance, precision, and perhaps most importantly, mercy when it was deserved. For now, I slept with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had orchestrated a reckoning that was both just and transformative. The stakes had been raised, consequences had been felt, and the household had begun the hard work of reassembly. That work would be messy, tender, and irreversible in its effects, and it would be the true measure of whether my retaliation had been for vengeance or for teaching. That morning, I woke before the sun. The house was silent, the kind of quiet that doesn't demand attention but invites reflection. The air smelled faintly of rain and jasmine, a soft reminder that even storms can leave sweetness behind. I sat by the window with my coffee, watching the world brighten, and realized it was the first time in a long while that I didn't feel the need to defend myself. The chaos had settled into calm, the noise had turned into understanding, and the anger that once burned in my chest had cooled into something far more enduring, clarity. I had fought the kind of battle most people never see, one that happens not with fists or shouting, but with patience, strategy, and truth. And I had won not by crushing anyone, but by making sure the lesson would last longer than the pain. When I think back to that night, the dinner I wasn't invited to, the cruel laughter, the humiliation in my own family's voice, it almost feels like a different life. I can still hear Cassie's voice on the phone, that sneer when she called me an old lady, the way my son laughed in the background. That sound used to haunt me, Now it's a distant echo, the voice of someone who didn't yet understand consequence. I used to replay it in my head, imagining all the ways I could have shouted back, slammed the phone, thrown their words right back at them. But I'm glad I didn't. Silence was my sharpest weapon. Reflection was my armor, and patience was my revolution. By the time the legal reviews were complete and the investigations closed, a strange peace had settled over everyone involved. My son stopped trying to charm his way through responsibility. He started showing up on time to meetings, speaking with humility instead of arrogance, and for once, listening more than he talked. I'd see him sometimes standing at the edge of the vineyard, his head bowed, as if finally understanding how much of life's balance depends on tending what you neglect. Cassie, too, changed, though her transformation was slower, more painful. I could see her pride breaking piece by piece, but in that breaking, something softer began to form. She started volunteering at the community center at first for appearances, but then because she realized that real people don't care about perfect makeup or fancy clothes, they care about presence. And for the first time, she began showing up for others, not for applause, but for meaning. It wasn't easy watching them struggle. There were nights when I questioned whether I had gone too far. I'd see Cassie crying on her porch, her voice muffled through the walls, and my heart, despite everything, would ache. I'd remember how young I once was, how easy it is to mistake status for strength, how cruel it can feel when the world suddenly refuses to obey your illusions. But then I'd remind myself of the woman who had been mocked, left out, humiliated for simply aging, for existing without apology. That woman, me deserved justice, not revenge for its own sake, but balance. I owed it to her to finish this story completely, not with bitterness, but with closure. One evening, near the end of summer, I invited them all to dinner. No hidden motives this time, just dinner. Cassie hesitated when she received the message. Probably thought it was a trap. My son called, nervous, asking if it was safe. I laughed softly and told him it's dinner, not Judgment Day. When they arrived, the table was set the way it always used to be, with candles and white linen and a vase of garden roses at the center. It looked almost like an old photograph come to life. For a moment, none of us spoke. Cassie's eyes darted around, looking for clues to my intentions. My son's hand rested nervously on her back, and I just smiled, letting the silence stretch until it became something almost gentle. Finally, I spoke. Sit. I said, eat. There's no punishment left here, just a story that needs to end the right way. They sat down, worried but curious, and I began to tell them. Not the details of what I'd done, but the reasons behind it. I told them how humiliation feels when it comes from the people you love most. How silence can cut deeper than shouting. How women like me are taught to swallow disrespect because we're older. Because we're supposed to be gracious even when our hearts are breaking. I told them I had spent years giving, teaching, nurturing, and that all I wanted in return was dignity. That night, I didn't sound like a conqueror. I sounded like a mother reclaiming her place at the table. Cassie's eyes welled up, and for once there was no performance in her expression. Just raw, unfiltered regret. I didn't know how cruel I'd become, she whispered. I thought it was just teasing. I shook my head. Teasing stops when the other person stops smiling, I said. After that, it's cruelty. My son reached across the table then, his hand trembling slightly as it touched mine. I was wrong too, Mom, he said. I let it happen. I thought being quiet meant keeping peace, but it just made me a coward. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in years, I saw not the boy who had disappointed me, but the man who was trying to make things right. We ate together quietly after that, not the kind of silence that comes from tension, but the kind that comes from understanding. The air was lighter. The food tasted richer. And for a moment, I thought of my late husband, how he would have smiled seeing this. His family finally learning that respect, not wealth, is what keeps a home whole. When dinner ended, Cassie stood and began clearing plates without being asked. My son helped her, both of them moving with the awkwardness of people learning new habits. I let them. Growth is slow, and sometimes humility looks like silence and small gestures. A few days later, Cassie stopped by alone. She looked different, not glamorous, not guarded, just real. She handed me an envelope and said softly, I wanted you to have this. Inside was a handwritten note and a receipt. She had repaid the exact amount from that infamous dinner $7.538, donated in my name to the local women's shelter. The note read, for every woman who has been silenced, and for the one who taught me what real strength looks like. I felt tears rise before I could stop them. It wasn't the money, it was the meaning. For the first time, she didn't owe me, she understood me. After that, things changed slowly but steadily. My son and Cassie moved into a smaller home when they could actually afford on their own without my help. They started living with intention instead of excess. Holidays became genuine again. Laughter returned, not the cruel kind that stings, but the soft kind that heals. Cassie even began inviting me to her new gatherings, small dinners with real friends, not social climbers. The first time she said, "Mom, could you bring your pie?" I nearly cried in the car on the way there. It wasn't about dessert, it was about belonging. One afternoon, I was pruning the garden when Cassie came over with her youngest daughter. The little girl, sweet as sunlight, ran up and hugged my legs. "Grandma Sadie, Mommy says you're the bravest person she knows," she said. My hands froze around the shears. Cassie smiled from the porch, tears in her eyes. That was the moment I knew the retaliation had served its purpose. Not just justice, but transformation. I hadn't raised enemies. I'd forced accountability, and it had grown into respect. In time, people stopped whispering about the incident. They started talking about how the family had changed, how we'd rebuilt what we broke. Some even came to me for advice on handling betrayal, on finding strength without turning bitter. And I'd tell them the truth: retaliation without purpose is just destruction. But when it's rooted in self-respect and calm strategy, it becomes redemption. One evening, as the sun set over the vineyard, my son came to sit beside me on the porch. He handed me a small wooden box. Inside was a silver keychain engraved with the words, "This house is yours." The same words I had once said coldly in defiance now returned with warmth. "You were right," he said quietly. "This house, our lives, they started with you, we just forgot." I closed the box and smiled. "You remembered now," I said. "That's enough. Life has a way of circling back when you least expect it. The same family that once laughed at me now protects me, respects me, includes me. And though part of me will always carry the scars of what they did, another part, the wiser one, knows that I wouldn't be here without them. My strength was forged in that fire. My peace was earned in that silence. And every lesson I taught them, I also taught myself. As I sit here now, watching the last light fade from the sky, I realize that retaliation was never about revenge. It was about reclamation, of dignity, of voice, of worth. I didn't destroy them. I rebuilt boundaries. I didn't humiliate them. I held up a mirror, and when they finally saw themselves clearly, they changed. Maybe that's the best kind of victory there is, the kind that doesn't end with someone kneeling, but with everyone standing taller. So if anyone asks me what I did that night, when I walked into that banquet hall after being mocked and humiliated, I'll tell them the truth. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply acted. I let the facts speak, the silence work, and the consequences teach. And because of that, today I sit here free, not vengeful, not bitter, just free. This was my story, my lesson, my retaliation.